Jedd Fisch is a Big Ten football coach. Welcome to 2024. That is Lars Hanson, co-host Locked On Huskies, joining me here on the show. Lars, we'll hit a couple of points, but first, your initial reaction to what Jedd Fisch said. The most kind of quotable moment was when he pointed out that Washington has beaten Oregon 3 times in a row, Texas 2 times in a row, and whatnot. Of course, he hasn't coached a game at Washington yet, but that's his university. That's accomplished all that.
Yeah, and he omitted the fact that he lost to Washington last year at Arizona, his former school. So the fact that Jedd is a salesman. That's the one thing I've learned about Jedd in his time at Washington. Jedd has no fear setting lofty expectations, whether they're even realistic or in the ballpark are realistic. He set the expectation for having the highest ranked recruiting class in Washington history for 2025. Whether they meet that or not, the idea that year one he's going to have that much success was a little bit lofty. So hearing Jedd's comments at the podium wasn't necessarily that much of a surprise in hindsight for someone who covers Washington, but it also is a little weird just in this whole Jedd Fisch is a Washington Big Ten head football coach. And also, weirdly enough, Washington did beat Oregon 3 years in a row and Texas twice in 2 bowl games. Worth noting, it's in 2 bowl games, not 2 regular season games. I have a hunch that game would have gone differently if it was in the regular season or in Austin. Just something different. There was a little bit of momentum going in UW's favor in both of those games. Obviously, the Sugar Bowl getting to the national championship game. But Jedd's got a lot of work to do because he, as he said in that opening remark, 46 new players. A brand new roster, a brand new coaching staff. The only coach that has any familiarity with us 2. Jimmy Doherty, the quarterback's coach, and tight ends coach Jordan Pauper, and also the special teams coordinator. Both coaches were at Washington with Steve Sarkisian back in 2012, 2013. Long time ago. The school has changed. It's a new conference. It's a new day. But Jedd is still the same old Jedd.
Yeah, and I think that for Washington this year, any coach and on the lofty expectations front, recruiting trail, whatever you want to talk about, I think it's fair for fans to say, have your reaction like, I don't know. But would you rather a coach strive for that or say he's going to strive for that and not actually have the ability to reach it? Or would you rather have someone come out and say, we just kind of accept where we're like, that's going to drive people, into a frenzy there. So I understand where he's coming from with all of that. But for this particular season, 46 new players, that's a Colorado level of turnover. Like that's an entirely new roster. 20 or 21 of the starters from last year's team gone to the NFL or the transfer portal. So where do you see Washington fitting into the conference they are now officially a new member of? I mean, the logos are formally up around here in Indianapolis. There's Michigan's logo over there, and then not far down the way, there's Washington, there's Oregon, there's USC and UCLA. Where does Washington for 2024 fit into that mix?
Washington fans are not going to like to hear this, but where the Big Ten unofficial preseason media polls had them between 9 and 10, basically in the dead middle of this 18-team Big Ten conference, which again, Big Ten, 18 teams, still all weird to say. But that's where Washington's at. They're not UCLA, bottom third. They're not struggling that much because I do think there's enough talent on the roster with Will Rogers, a 5th-year, 6th-year quarterback coming from Mississippi State, Jonah Coleman. There's enough pieces. And then you also bring in Steve Belichick as this defensive coordinator from the New England Patriots. So there's enough pieces to not be totally awful, but by no means is this a 9-10 win team going to the college football playoff, even in an expanded college football playoff. So I think having their expectation be the middle of the conference, I have them finishing 7-5, 8-4, depending on which certain games. And the key games are not in November. I'm already saying they're losing to Oregon. I'm already saying they can lose to Penn State. Those are already guaranteed losses on the schedule. If they happen to win those games, so be it.
And they go to Penn State,
and they go
right?
to Penn State, and they go to Eugene, and those are all in the month of November. Those games against Rutgers on Friday night at the end of September and Iowa City on October 12th. I know those. When you hear those 2 schools, they're like, who cares about Iowa and Rutgers? But those are now the new tough games of the conference. Those are the Oregon State games. Those are the Cal games, which Washington did struggle with in the latter years of the Pac-12, going down to the Bay Area, sneaking some away, and even actually losing to Cal in 2019, the Lightning year.
The Lightning
year. I don't even know what year that was.
I think it was 2019.
It was 2019 because it was Chris Peterson's last year.
Yep.
Chris Peterson came on the microphone at 1:30 in the morning saying, "We're getting ready to play," and I'm like, "There's 10 people in the stands. This is awesome." And I got home at 3 in the morning, so there's a lot that has changed in that regard. But these are new challenges for Washington. Going across the country to New Jersey, they did that before. but that was for home and home back in, 2015, 2014, over a decade ago. Clearly over a decade ago in that regard. And Rutgers has gotten better. Greg Schiano's there. So these are all different tough outs. There's no way that you can say Washington is on the same level of Oregon this year. There's an unbiased look at both rosters would say, yeah, there's Washington that has talent, but Oregon is a couple yards, maybe a couple first downs.
And I think the biggest difference between those two teams specifically, the returners. Yeah. Like Washington's got a lot of talented newcomers, but Oregon has matched or even surpassed that in the transfer portal. If you look at the 24/7 rankings, that's the way you'd see it. You can say that's not the best way to look at it, fine, but Oregon's brought in some heavy hitters in the transfer portal, and they have a core of returners, guys that have all-conference capability or NFL draft capability as well. But I'm glad you brought up Will Rogers, because I think when you talk about the landscape of quarterbacks in the Big Ten, I think this is the weakest the weakest quarterback conference in the Power Four. I think the Big 12 is probably the best, or the SEC. Those are the top two. I think the ACC is squarely in third. I think the Big Ten is clearly fourth. That said, Will Rogers is not at the bottom of that conference. He's not at the top either. He's right. Not there, but he's not a guy that is going to go out and struggle to throw for 200 yards in a game. This isn't Jeff Sims at Nebraska last year. Will Rogers is a quarterback that if you put Will Rogers on Michigan this year, I think that would answer a lot of questions.
Absolutely, and I think, the key factor for Washington is you can have, Will Rogers is a great quarterback, and I think he's going to win the job, and DeMond's going to be the starter in 25, and so on and so forth. But my question, Will's a good quarterback, but he has to have an offensive line, and I look at Washington's offensive line right now. It's a problem. You know what? It could turn out to be good. It's a boom or bust situation where you're bringing in a former JUCO All-American left tackle who hasn't played in 18 months, a starting left guard who had an ACL injury last season, a Portland State center, an Ohio State fifth-year right guard who only had 2 starts in his entire career in Columbus, and a decent starting right tackle at San Diego State, Drew Azzopardi, who started for 1 year. That, to me, Will Rogers, and I think that the reason why Will Rogers is so important, having that veteran presence at the quarterback position, setting up the offense, setting up the offensive line, helping kind of massage some of those kinks early on, might end up producing 1 or 2 extra wins that would not come with a different type of quarterback. The question is Will going to have enough time? I think it's a perfect marriage between him and Jedd, and you have to remember, he committed to Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb. That was who he wanted to play for, and by the time he ended up looking in the portal a second time around, he was going G5. That was the only other option he could. There wasn't a ton of other Power 4 options.
Everybody the quarterback carousel had kind of already played itself out.
Exactly, and so it was a perfect mix to end up with Jedd, an offensive coach. So there's no Jimmy Lake factor of I got a defensive head coach and I'm an offensive and I'm a quarterback, but there's still so many. It's the mystery team in college football. It is the flat. That's the only way that I can describe it. It's the mystery team in college football because, there's a lot of potential, but potential on paper can go up in flames pretty quick. At the end of September, if you're 3-3.
I think if the O line struggles, those Oregon and Michigan games could get ugly because those are premier defensive lines. And so I want to close with Michigan. You talked to Donovan Edwards earlier while he was here at Big Ten Media Days about the rematch with Washington. What did he say that was notable? And then your quick thoughts on that game that is a rematch of the national championship game, but certainly it's going to look and feel very different. You got new coaches, new players, you got new everything, and the game's being played in Seattle instead of a neutral site.
And a perfect segue into that, Donovan Edwards also mentioned the 21 game, again, when Washington traveled to Michigan under Jimmy Lake, and having that debacle, the way that game went down, right. I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And this is why it's a perfect game to have in October, because you get the month of September to warm up, get everything figured out, and try and give Michigan your biggest punch, because they're going to get Washington's biggest punch. I just don't know how well it's going to connect when you look at the rush. Michigan does. You don't have J.J. McCarthy, but you do have Donovan Edwards. You have Will Johnson, who's a lockdown cornerback. So there's a lot of pieces that Michigan has.
Mason Graham, probably the best interior defensive lineman in this upcoming draft
class. I was already kind of just gifting that because of our talks with the offensive line. If Mason Graham doesn't have more than 3 sacks against Washington, I will be very surprised.
It'd be a win, morally, of course.
Exactly. But for me in this game of Washington, I don't expect them to win. I would say they're probably going to be 10-point underdogs coming into the game.
8.5, 9.5 is kind of where the line is. It opened 11.5, which I thought was a little bit too high. I think right around 8 or 9 is about right.
And so I can see the win for Washington is you lose by 4, or you lose on a field goal, or
Right.
you lose on a one possession. The key for Washington, do not have that second half result in the national championship game come up at home against Michigan again, because Washington disappeared in the second half, where there was so much fight that I was expecting in that national championship game that never came. And now you have some of those still guys, Cameron Figliolani, Carson Bruner, Alfonso Chiputala, linebacker, a handful of guys that were a part of that 23 team that still have a little sour taste in their mouth from everything that went on. I have a hunch they're going to get up for that game. I don't expect them to win, but I don't think it's going to be a blowout unless, of course, as we said, the offensive line is just in absolute chaos, which is a separate result.
I think that's where the mismatch could come into play, is Michigan's D-line, Washington's offensive line. One thing I do know for sure, Michigan's going to get the best punch from that Seattle crowd. Like, you know that no matter what has happened in Washington's seasons up to that point, and they should have several wins on their resume at that point in the season, crowd should have that. I don't know if it'll be the Oregon gear from a season ago, but I think they'll certainly be cranked up to a 9 or 10 on the noise meter.
Nothing will top that Oregon game. I will tell you that. Watching that on the sideline, hearing the silence in the air as Camden Lewis his kick was in the air, nothing will ever top that.
Lars Hanson, co-host Locked On Huskies here at Big Ten Media Days, joining me in person. Lars, appreciate it, man.
Always, Spencer.